Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Josh Phillips again, and today we are going to discuss conflict. As you see on this video, this says conflict day 1. We are going to do conflict day 2, but that's just going to be for my students in their online learning portal. It's not going to be posted on YouTube because day 2 isn't going to be as significant. It's going to be more academic jargon and definitions. But this discussion on conflict was going to be a little bit more robust with some, more fun images and video. So I went ahead and decided it would probably be best to post this up on YouTube. Okay, so conflict day 1. What is conflict and why does it happen? So just let's get a book definition here for what conflict is. It's an expressed struggle between two independent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. All right, so we have these 3 items as to how and why conflict might manifest in a system where 2 independent parties are present. Let's work through each one of these quickly. Incompatible goals means that the 2 individuals involved have different values and they're trying to live sort of within a similar community or same geographical area within the same country, right? And if they have 2 different values and belief systems, they might have a hard time living together. They're going to sort of clash up and have friction with regard to creating certain economic policies, welfare policies, immigration policies, healthcare policies, etc. Right? This is something that I refer to in some of my other classes when we talk about the paradox of multiculturalism. So multiculturalism sounds really good and something that we shouldn't argue about, right? Like we should all sort of embrace and tolerate different groups and their beliefs and respect other people's beliefs and be inclusive. All of those things are great. Like you should be polite to other people who have different, beliefs and values and cultures than you. You should be polite to them, right? However, we also have to recognize that on some core beliefs, there are cultures who clash with one another and have values that are so different that it's hard to make those values compatible sort of under the same legal system, for instance. All right. So when 2 different cultures come together and they have different values, very core values, they are going to clash and there is going to create friction with regard to having some sort of conflict. All right. So not all beliefs can sort of be equally upheld all the time. Even though we want to be respectful and tolerant of other people's individual beliefs, at the end of the day, sometimes policies have to be put on paper, laws have to be passed, and sometimes those laws are going to be in direct contrast with somebody's sort of core beliefs and values. Scarce resources, one of the first rules of economics with regard to how does an economy even get going is this idea of scarce resources. So things only cost money because they're limited. If things were abundant all the time, they would be free, right? Now, things might be really, really cheap because because they are extremely available, but they're still limited in regard to the material to put the thing together, the amount of labor that it takes to sort of put the thing together, right? They might be very, very abundant, but the abundance, it's still limited around some core issues. So things might be cheap, right? But they don't cost $0, right? Scarce resources is the first rule of economics, which means the only reason an economy can get going, the only reason I want to give you money for a product that you're willing to give me is because I don't have it and you do, right? If I could go find it for free somewhere, I wouldn't need to give you money for that thing, okay? So scarce resources. Conflict can happen because there are scarce resources. Now, there's 2 ways to solve this problem of scarce resources. The first is sort of, free trade between you and I, right? You have the resource that I want, and I can give you money for it, right? And so that's an easy way to sort of solve the conflict might be a strong word, but to solve the dilemma of you not having money and me not having the item, right? All of a sudden we make a trade, right? So there's a little bit of a tension because it's like I want that item and you want the money, so we trade, right? The other way that you can solve the scarce resource problem is what has happened through most of human history, is that you have land, I have a kingdom that wants land, I go send my army to kill all of your people off the land, and all of a sudden I have your resource, which is the land, right? Or the minerals or whatever it is I'm trying to, get access to. All right. So scarce resources can cause conflict with regard to Two people who want the same thing, and that thing, there's only one of them, and so now we might have to fight it out physically, or we have to work out some sort of trade economic negotiation. All right, so that's why things can be in conflict, scarce resources. And finally, interference. Interference means that if you, and let's say a boyfriend-girlfriend situation, all right, if you and your girlfriend end up in some sort of conflict over a situation, the conflict is the interference, and you say, but you know what? This relationship is worth fighting for. So you are willing to engage in the conflict because upholding the relationship is worth fighting for. If the relationship wasn't worth it, a conflict would happen, and you would say, you know what? Let's just break up. Let's go our separate ways. There's no reason to solve the conflict because we're not going to be together, in the next 5 minutes anyways. All right. So when the net benefit of keeping and holding on to the relationship is worth it to you, you are going to be willing to engage in the conflict. If the relationship's not worth it, like, that's one of those things. It's like, well, walk away. Like, who cares if that person's angry at me because they're not a part of my life, right? Whether or not it's a significant other, whether or not it's a friendship, whether or not it's some acquaintance that you have, a coworker, what have you, right? Interference can cause a conflict if you want the relationship to last. Do we need conflict? All right. So when we hear conflict, we usually have negative connotations around it. So we usually say, no, I don't like conflict in my life. There's too much tension and stress about it. It can dissolve relationships. Obviously, if you have too much conflict, the relationship's going to go kaput. All right. And finally, it can lead to combat, whether it's verbal combat, saying nasty things to each other, or physical violence, right? This is where we usually think about conflict. What I'm going to focus on for the rest of this video are the positive aspects of conflict, all right, which I think are far more meaningful. So there are a lot of pros to engaging in conflict. The first pro of engaging in conflict is it actually helps you discover who you are, right? So it can help you discover who everybody is sort of engaged in the conflict, but it can especially help you figure out who you are in the conflict. So what this means, all right, is that if you get engaged in a conflict, you have to figure out whether or not you are actually a person who is true to your values and beliefs. So if you stand up and say, look, I'm a person willing to fight for my beliefs, and then your beliefs come in direct conflict with someone else and you kind of shy away from it, well, you just found out that you're not as courageous as you thought, right? There's been a lot of people who have given some academics and religious scholars who have given some very fun, interesting antidotes to this dilemma when it comes to the issue of adultery, right? Having sex outside of marriage, right? So they'll say something to the effect of, a guy walks around and says, well, I would never, cheat on my wife, right? The first question is, well, have you ever been tempted to, right? Are you the kind of guy who just kind of walks in the room and, ladies swarm around you, right, and want to give you lots of attention, right? And if your answer is no, not really, well, then you've never been in a conflictual situation where you actually have to test your values and beliefs, right? But if you walk around and say, look, I'm a person who is not going to engage in adultery, and you've actually been tempted, and then you're able to uphold your values and beliefs not to engage in adultery, you learn a lot about yourself, all right? But if you're a person who goes around and your core beliefs, so we're talking about some sort of religious values and beliefs right now, if your core beliefs have never been tested with regard to, whatever religion you have, you actually don't really know that much about yourself as far as your deep core religious convictions and beliefs. If as soon as you're put in a difficult situation, right, a situation that tempts you, right, as far as in an adultery situation, for instance, if you want to go down that direction, or tempts you as far as whether or not you can steal a little bit of money, out of the cash register you're working at, whether or not you can lie to your parents, right, if you're staying out late at night, right? If you've never actually been in a situation where you have been tempted to do something that is against your own beliefs, you actually don't know a lot about yourself. So what conflict is good about is I have this value, and my value is now in direct conflict with my temptation, right? Whatever that temptation is, right, from some sort of religious idea, right? And once those two things are in conflict with each other, my values and the temptation, now all of a sudden I get a chance to actually see whether or not my values are upheld. And if they're not upheld, I've just learned a lot about myself. If they are upheld, I've learned a lot about myself as well. Oh, I guess I am the kind of person who actually believes what it is I say I believe. So in a conflict situation, People get to sort of test themselves. They get to test their relationship. They get to see who other people actually are, right? But you can't do that unless you sort of throw yourself in the fire and allow yourself to have these sort of conflict moments. The other thing that I think is really cool about conflict, that I like about conflict, is that if you and a friend or a significant other get engaged in conflict and you can successfully manage it, you can successfully get out of it, then all of a sudden you strengthen the relationship. So we all have these honeymoon phases, and whether or not it's a romantic relationship or it's a friendship, right? These honeymoon phases are me and this other person just kind of know each other on the surface, but eventually we're going to run into some sort of bump. And once we run into that bump, we have a choice to make. We're either going to dissolve the relationship because we say it's not worth it anymore, it's not worth the interference, right? Or we're going to say, hey, you know what? We're going to work this out together, and then we're going to know that the two of us together are the type of couple who has the ability and the communication skills to work through a conflict. So we successfully managed that first conflict. So we know that if we ever come across the conflict again, a year down the road, 10 years down the road, we know that we are strong sort of in that regard, as opposed to, you know, a couple or a friendship that never has conflict, and all of a sudden 10 years in the road you have that first disagreement and everything blows up and it's like, I didn't know who you were, right? I never saw you in a difficult situation. So conflict can reveal a lot about the two people involved in the conflict. It can tell you a lot about yourself, right? Whether or not you're gonna, actually uphold your beliefs, right? And it can actually strengthen the relationship if you and that person successfully manage the conflict. So let's not put our head in the ground and say, oh, let's avoid conflict all the time. Let's instead say conflict's going to happen, and what good can come out of this conflict? And the good thing that can come out of the conflict is me and my significant other are going to figure out how to successfully manage it, and we're going to get through it. And that way we're going to know that our relationship is a lot stronger than a relationship that says, oh, conflict, I guess we're just going to dissolve right away because they don't want to deal with it. So, do you need personal hardships in your life? Yes, you do. And we're going to talk about this guy named Hercules, all right? His name is Hercules in the Greek, and we'll talk about this briefly. So, Hercules was the Roman god. Heracles was the Greeks. For those who don't know, you could look at, I have a YouTube video on Plato's Apology where I talk a little bit about the relationship between the Greeks and the Romans. Long story short, before the year 0, the Greeks were basically in charge. Like, they created all the gods that we know. Then Rome became the Roman Empire, right? So now like Rome and like what's now Italy sort of takes over, right? And they get into power, and basically all they do is they just steal all of the Greek gods that were already popular, and they just put different names on them. So Heracles was the Greek god, right, that we know, but we now know him in Rome as Hercules. The Greek god who was in charge of all the gods was Zeus. The Romans took over and they're like, we don't like Zeus that much, we're going to call him Jupiter. The Greek god of war was Ares. They were like, we don't really like Ares, so the Romans turned him into Mars. An easy way to remember this is if you think of all the planets were discovered by the Romans, so they're the ones who named them all. All right. They didn't discover all of them, but just go with me for a second. All right. So all the planets are named after Roman gods. If you ever hear a different name, you're like, it might be Greek instead. All right. But all the Greek gods were laid out, and then the Romans were just like, we just like all those stories where we're going to keep them. We're just going to kind of give them different names. All right. Hercules was the son of the god Jupiter, and again in the Greek it's Zeus, right? And this mortal woman. And this is a story that I want to talk about quick about Hercules, because I think this is far more interesting and important about Hercules than all of the heroic, super strongman stuff that we see in Disney cartoons. All right, we do all this stuff with Hercules. He's this big, powerful, guy, right? I think that is, it's fun, right, for a superhero story, but I don't think it's the most important thing about him. This is the most important thing about Hercules. So we have this sort of crossroads story of Hercules near the beginning of his life. All right. Near the beginning of his life, this is sort of like the Hercules origin story, I guess. All right. As far as, he's got to choose, what life he's going to live. So he's walking around one day and he gets to a fork in the road, right? And we can, there's plenty of metaphors to be, to go in this direction. He gets to this fork in the road and he meets 2 women. All right. And the first woman is named Vice. Depending on the telling, it might also be Joy, but we're just going to go with Vice and Virtue to make it nice and symmetrical. So the first woman he meets is Vice, all right? And Vice says, Hercules, if you go down this path and if you follow me, you're going to have a life of abundance, and it's going to be pleasurable, and you're going to have all the money and the women and the wine, and you're going to get fat and happy watching Netflix all day, and it is going to be beautiful, right? That's the life you can have. Virtue, then he goes over, and then there's virtue. And virtue says, look, Hercules, I ain't going to mess around. If you follow me, life is going to be super hard. There's going to be a lot of conflict. There's going to be a lot of struggle, right? There's going to be a lot of pain, but you're going to, if you follow me and if you get through all of that struggle and that pain, you are going to come out the back end and you are going to feel this sense of accomplishment and this sense of purpose, and you're going to feel proud of yourself, and you're going to be bestowed with honor, right? And Hercules is like, yeah, virtue, that sounds awesome, right? This is incredible. And this is the story of Hercules I wish they would teach, little 6-year-old kids as opposed to the Disney cartoon stuff, right? Hercules had the choice. He was like, I can stay in the palace, right? Which is, I guess similar to Siddhartha's story, right? And became the Buddha. It's like, I can stay in the palace. I can stay fat and happy. I can watch Netflix all day. I'm going to have everyone take care of me, but I'm never going to have a sense of accomplishment. I'm never going to know what I'm made of. Or I can go down the road of conflict, down the road of virtue, and have to go through the fire, but if I make it and I survive, I come out the other end and I feel just like I accomplished something. And that's the road he chooses, right? He chooses the road of virtue. Along the road of virtue, right, we run into these 12 labors. So these are like hard tasks, obviously, like killing this lion that is impossible to penetrate with a sword, obviously, is, going to be difficult. Slaying a hydra, where every time you chop off its head, 2 more grow in its place. Stealing these like man-eating horses is probably not fun. And then stealing golden apples, from this magical land is also not fun. So he has to go through, and there's, 12 total. These are just 4 of them, right? So he has to go through these tasks of like doing impossible, hard things. But he's like, I want to do that. I want to test myself, right? As opposed to never testing yourself at all, right? So we go back to that story on the last slide, where if you're a person who's like, I will never give in to temptation because I am holier than thou, and someone says, have you ever been tempted before? And you're like, no, I've never been tempted before. Then how do you know whether or not you're going to sort of uphold your values and beliefs? And Hercules was like, I want to test myself. I want to put myself in situations where conflict is going to happen, where death might be imminent, because I want to test my abilities. Here's just a couple pictures and paintings of Hercules accomplishing some of these different tasks. So this gets into our discussion on Stoicism, all right? And what Stoicism says is that the world is unpredictable and bad things are going to happen, right? And when bad things happen, you shouldn't react emotionally, either positive or negatively to a situation, right? But you should just control what you can, right? So this is kind of leading back to our discussion on Hercules, right? You can go through life with the naivete that nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. And if you think nothing bad is ever going to happen to you, then you never have to prepare for anything bad, right? But Hercules chose virtue because he's like, well, I might as well test myself because, stuff is going to happen. And I would rather test myself and be prepared for it than just sit around and act as if nothing bad is ever going to happen, right? So if you can willingly engage in conflict, what you are helping yourself to do is you're helping yourself get, emotionally and physically prepared for when really, really hard conflict comes up. So if you can kind of take these moments and it's like, I want to work through small little bits of conflict at a time when I can, that way you sort of steel yourself up for when difficult conflict comes up, all right? So because life is going to be filled with pain, struggle, conflict, etc., what should you do? All right, you should be prepared, right? You should plan and prepare for conflict before it happens. All right, so this is what this might look like. All right, so this is a guy named Seneca who is a founding sort of individual of Stoicism, right? And he says the following. He says, it is in times of security, so when things are good, when your life is fantastic, in times of security that the spirit should be preparing itself for difficult times, while fortune is bestowing favors, then is the time to be strengthened against her rebuffs. So what he's saying is like, why the sun is shining, why life is really good for you, get yourself ready for conflict. Now, you can hope and pray like conflict never comes, right? I don't want anybody in my class, I hope everybody has a wonderful, happy life. right? But while things are very, very happy right now, you should kind of get it into your head that conflict comes to everyone's life. You know, you might have a relationship that starts to fall apart, and it's like, how do you prepare for that? Right now, we're in the middle of this global pandemic with COVID. It's like, were you prepared for sitting around and being in your house for 6 months at a time? What did you do to make sure that you're ready just in case you kind of gotta like hunker down for a while? This is what the Stoics were all about, right? It wasn't a question of like, oh, I hope conflict doesn't happen. Instead, it was a recognition that conflict is going to happen. I don't know what the conflict in my life is going to be yet, but while things are really good for me, I'm going to go ahead and prepare for when conflict does happen. So some of the Stoic practices that are sort of laid out in these ancient texts that are 2,000 years old, right? They would subject themselves to extreme heat and extreme cold, right? So this idea of like, if I ever get kind of stuck out in the wilderness for a few months at a time, like I might need to be prepared for extreme hot and extreme cold times. They would practice physical exhaustion, right? So you can think about strenuous exercise. And again, this happens sort of in some regards, as best as it can 2,000 years ago. But if we think about it today, strenuous exercise happens in a controlled, healthy environment, right? If you go to the gym, you can put yourself through a lot of strain and know like there's other people around. If you hurt yourself, you're not going to hurt yourself too badly because it's like there's plenty of like medical availability around you to make sure that you don't get injured. They would limit the food that they ate, right? So they would practice fasting for days at a time because they say I might one day be in a situation where I don't have food available at all, and when that crisis comes, I don't want that to be the first time that I've never had food available. So I want to practice prolonged fasting. So they would do these sort of strenuous exercises in controlled environments to get their bodies ready for if an uncontrolled event happens, they've been ready for it. So I like to think about this like Navy SEAL training, right? Very strenuous, right? But still in a controlled way where there's plenty of staff around. There's medical there's medical help around in case something goes off the rails. But for the most part, it's like we're going to put you through the most extreme circumstances that we can imagine, just to get you ready for when you are somewhere by yourself overseas in a small group of 5 people and you have no one else to count on. Then you're going to be ready for it because we've put you through this very hard situation that's going to be harder than anything you hopefully will ever have to deal with. All right. So this is what Stoicism is about. And again, this goes back to Hercules and this whole idea of conflict of you should be seeking out moments where you can have these, where you can practice conflict, where you can practice discomfort, because when life does throw real conflict and discomfort at you, you want to make sure that you've gone through the practice of taking care of it. So one of my favorite excerpts from Marcus Aurelius in his book Meditations. I'm going to skip through some of it, just read the yellow parts for you, right? But he says, when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself the following: the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly, right? So he says, like, every morning when I wake up, I'm just going to tell myself that I'm going to meet a lot of very unpleasant people, right? There's going to be someone who cuts me off in traffic. There's going to be students who write me nasty emails. I might get into a disagreement with a colleague about certain classes, right? I might have a hard conversation with my significant other, right? But Marcus Aurelius, you can jump down here. He's like, look, like no one can implicate me in ugliness, right? No one can sort of bait me in, right? I don't have to engage back with them, right? If they are being ungrateful or arrogant, right? He says, look, we were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like 2 rows of teeth, upper and lower. So he's like, we all are kind of in this together, right? And for every time I look at someone and I'm like, oh, that person is so ungrateful and dishonest, they're a jerk, right? I kind of remember, like, sometimes I'm a jerk too, right? And if every morning I wake up and just sort of prepare myself like, hey, the world's tough. Today I might meet somebody who is going through the worst day of their life. And if I can just kind of be prepared for that, then I'm going to be less willing, then I'm going to be, less willing to engage with them, right? I might be a little bit more grace. I might give them a little bit more grace today, right? So you don't have to worry about engaging with all the ugliness and nastiness in the world. You just go around and you say, look, I can only control how I react to this person. I can't, control what they say to me, if they say mean, nasty things to me, or how they treat me, right? But if I can remember that, then all of a sudden I've planned and I've prepared to go out there and realize like conflict might happen between me and other people, and I'm just going to try to do the best I can. So finally, what can you do to prepare for conflict? All right. First thing you can do, right, if we talk about health and fitness, you can have health and fitness. You can be physically fit before the zombie apocalypse or anything else, right? So some of the conversations going on right now with the coronavirus situation is people are learning a lot about things like comorbidities, which are sort of pre-existing conditions, right? It's like, well, maybe we all need to be eating healthier. Maybe we need to do a little bit more cardio to get our lungs ready. We should probably do a lot more to make sure that, type 2 diabetes seems to be a common ailment in some of these individuals who are being hospitalized. It's like, what can we do to make sure that we're physically fit so that when we are put into a situation where physicality is necessary, we are going to be in the best shape that we can be, right? And again, like while the sun is shining, go back to that stuff with Seneca, where he's like, why things are really, really good in life, you should be preparing for when things are bad in life, all right? Prepare your life for emergencies, right? So food, shelter, and savings, again, right? We didn't know that we were going to be locked down for a long time, so it's like, when this thing hit, it's like, if the grocery stores everyone's gonna be cleaning out the grocery stores. It's like, do I have, 30 days of food? Do I have a little bit of cash on hand? If the world tells me to shut down tomorrow, I know personally, like I have 30 days of just stuff in my house to take care of me and my dog, right? And after 30 days, might be a little bit rough, but I know that, if they say you can't go outside for 30 days, like, I was like, fine, I'm just gonna lock down and I'm not gonna worry about it, right? So what are you doing in your life to make sure that you're prepared for when those conflicts happen, more physical threat conflicts? Now, what about relationship conflicts, right? So let's go back to the whole beginning of this. Are you talking to your friends and your family about possible conflicts before they happen, right? So some of the things that might happen between friends and family include things like money, right? If you and your brothers and sisters are dealing with an elderly parent or a grandparent who's about to pass away, like, are you having these conversations right now about how the will is going to happen before grandma dies, and now you all have to fill it out, right? Or are you having these conversations while grandma's alive so grandma can say, look, this is how you all need to not fight, so you're having some sort of interaction with that, right? So you want to make sure that you're engaging with people about possible conflicts before they become real conflicts, right? Are you dealing with conversations about money before money actually becomes a problem? Are you dealing with things like death of a loved one before that loved one actually dies? With regard to marriage counseling, are you and your significant other, if you're about to get married, right? Some couples, they do things like pre-marriage counseling, right? I don't know anything about pre-marriage counseling, but I've heard it's good, right? But just this idea that, if you get married with someone, like, are you taking the proper steps to make sure that you all have a good plan of action for when conflict happens in your relationship, as opposed to just waiting until money becomes a problem before, like, the 7-year itch becomes a problem and someone starts straying from the marriage before, are you having conversations about kids and how you're going to raise kids? It's like, you don't want to have a baby and then say, well, I'm Jewish and you're Christian. You're like, how are we going to raise the kid? Like, you should be having these conversations beforehand before it becomes an actual argument. If somebody loses their job, like, who's going to work, who's not going to work, right? You should have these conversations, again, before the conflict arises. For students in my class, are you talking to your professors in week 4 to 6 if your grade and your attendance is terrible? All right, this is one thing that happens every semester. You might be one of the students this happens to. You have a terrible grade and it's week 15 and you're knocking on my door or emailing me and saying, can I talk about this assignment that was due in week 3? I say, no, you should have talked to me about that assignment in week 3, right? So are you taking care of a conflict while it is an anthill before it turns into a mountain, right? Are you taking care of that conflict as soon as it arises, all right? Same thing is true with a boss. Are you talking to a boss as soon as you feel overwhelmed at work so it doesn't snowball into something greater, okay? Again, look at Hercules, look at the 12 labors that he overtook, or that he took on himself, because again, he wanted to engage in a life of virtue as opposed to a life of vice. He could have stepped back, right? He's the son of a god, right? Son of Jupiter. It's like, I could have just hung out, had a nice life, watch Netflix all day and been cool. But he's like, no, like, I want to test myself. And the way that you test yourself is to put yourself in situations that will test your values, your beliefs, your physical attributes, right? And for us, mere mortals, right? Not Hercules here, half God kind of stuff, right? For us mere mortals, it's all about putting yourself in conflict simulations before real conflict happens. So you and your spouse having a conversation of like, what happens when we have kids? Like if we have kids, like what happens if, money runs out? Like, talking to your family, what happens if grandma dies, right? Have those conversations. Make sure that you are practicing ways to engage with conflict before real conflict happens. Conflict's going to happen. And the best way to do it is if you do like a pseudo conflict situation, it's going to make you tougher over the long run. It's going to put you in better physical shape. It's going to put you in good shape for preparing for life's emergencies, and it's going to put you in good relationship shape because you, your family, your friends, significant others have worked through conflict before real conflict arises. All right. So all this to say, when it comes to conflict, don't think of it as a negative word. Embrace it. I definitely encourage you to find ways to challenge yourself, to put yourself in situations that are difficult for you, especially when the sun is shining, especially when you know that there's some sort of safety net around you to catch you in case the conflict goes off the rails. But you should struggle a little bit, right? And if you struggle and you get out the other side, you feel a sense of accomplishment. You feel a sense of a strengthening of your relationship if you're going through conflict in a relationship. All right. Conflict is good if you treat it the right way. Just keep being prepared. Find little ways to engage with it. All right. Okay, that's all I have for today. For my class, you'll see part 2 on Canvas later this week. Otherwise, I will see you all later.